governing through authoritarian law and policy, which long predated the contagion. And let me stop there and turn it back to Lynette with my thanks. And so you can turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mark. Next, we have Pan Sharma.
Thank you, Lynette.
Fear of a pandemic emergency. Please go ahead.
Yeah, let me just share my screen. I hope it is visible now.
Yes, it is, Punch. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. Pandemics have been a central part of human history, a focal point of human-animal sociology, reframing our social codes and behavioral norms, a substantial challenge for medicine, science, and technology, a peril for economic solidarity, and extraordinary defiance of governance, state, and democracy. Through this paper, I'm trying to see pandemic emergency in the frame of emergency powers as it has been used. So I have classified my paper in 5 parts with an attempt to look beyond the normative and legalized definitions and justification of pandemic, as it allows innocuous exercise of emergency power by executive. Pandemics throughout the world has allowed exceptional and emergency power over our lives to save lives, as contagion bears the power of death and serious illness. For that, the first objective of mine is to make an interaction between pandemic emergency and theory. Second is to see it beyond the current situation, as pandemic is a historical truth. More importantly, a historical lesson we often forget. I have titled it as Historodemic. It is also a sociological challenge, more importantly, a sociological reality that we tend to ignore. I have termed it as sociodemic, and also a governance nightmare, a governance crisis beyond comprehension. I have titled it as governodemic. For example, COVID pandemic prompted more than 108 countries to use emergency power, either formal or informal emergency power, leading to arbitrariness and dictatorship in some cases, disrupting the ages-old principle of rule of law, separation of power, and restricting or abandoning the human rights mechanism we have opted for. That's why the pandemic emergency power needs to be analyzed in the prism of theory of emergency powers. And that's how we could lead to a grounded theory of pandemic emergency, which is the object of this paper. For example, the interplay between pandemic and use of emergency power is so evident that pandemic theoretically and practically allows questionably justification of emergency power without answering a key question, whether law has recognized pandemic as emergency or not. Because to recognize an event as an emergency, we need to answer 3 questions: the question of urgency, the question of anticipation, and the question of imminent and immediate actions. If pandemic qualifies for these situations, which I have listed, it is important to ascertain that which model we are opting for to handle a pandemic situation, whether we are opting for a standard formal emergency power model, or whether we are going for a specific pandemic emergency model. So these two are different. General emergency models are there in every constitution, and nowadays people are talking about that how can we add pandemic emergency within that framework. But most of the state opted for the third model, which is decree-based, executive-centric, undeclared emergency power. It is interesting to see that so many countries have developed a jurisprudentially sound emergency doctrines and emergency protocols, but still they have not opted for it. And that's why it is important to see pandemic from historical and sociological prism, that how history has dealt with pandemic. For example, WHO recognized pandemic as disease occurring over a wide geography affecting a significant portion of population. But we need to see pandemic beyond this definition, as pandemic becomes an opportunity to use emergency powers. It happened way back in Roman time, like between 168 to 544 CE. There were 300 years of pandemics in Roman era, and Romans went for the dictatorial model and dictatorship. It is also interesting to see that this dictatorial model to control pandemic continued even when Romans were not under a pandemic situation. So even in history, pandemic has become an opportunity to use arbitrary power. History repeats, but it how often we ignore it, it is in front of us, because we can find astonishing similarities between the Roman model and the current way in which the emergency powers has been used. See, for an example of cholera pandemic, which British colonial power felt is just limited to India until and unless it reached to the shores of England, and then they went on for very strict lockdowns and a very strict mechanism in British India, cutting all the food chains, resulting in the biggest famine of human civilization, that was the Bengal famine. And I can see identical similarities in that approach to current India's approach during first wave, when Prime Minister Modi one fine evening announced 91 days harshest lockdown ever during COVID. And the situation is not limited to India. Sri Lanka went for the forced cremation. It is identically same to what happened in Black Plague, when the bodies were burnt legally after sunset and before sunrise. Similarly, Tanzania refused to share the data. Myanmar used it as an opportunity for military power. Russia has used same to stifle the dissent. Hungary used the same power as a coronavirus coup, we have heard. Turkey has also used the same kind of power. Philippines, Cambodia, Israel, China, you name the country which is not there, which has not used pandemic as an opportunity. Just to see you a situation that how irrational decision making, premature decision making and celebrations has been a part of our pandemic management. See, there is Prime Minister Modi declaring a victory over COVID in January at World Economic Forum. Within 30 days, this happened in India. India registered the highest numbers of COVID cases in one day. Any country has not registered more than these cases. That allows me to see world in a different prism. That allows me to see pandemic as a governodemic as it happened. And if we classify all the states, we can find 5 identifiable patterns of exercising emergency powers or non-emergency power in the name of not informal emergency power without declaring it as an emergency. For example, first states were there who applied informal emergency constitution power, whether specific pandemic emergency or considering pandemic as a situation for a general threat for the security of state, thereby using the generic emergency power. East Timor, Indonesia, Japan, Mauritius, Philippines, Thailand, Spain, France, Hungary, Chile, Estonia. No matter what, these countries have used the formal emergency power or specific emergency power. Interesting thing is that some of these countries have no mention of public health emergency. Other states which have not opted for emergency power, they went for the pre-existing pandemic emergency laws, allowing extraordinary power for executive, thereby creating a situation like undeclared emergency and restricting freedom and human rights. Third, countries in which India also falls, used the general laws and statute with liberal interpretation, allowing exceptional power to handle pandemic, allowing bylaw and decree-based governance. Fourth pattern that we found is combining general laws with pre-existing pandemic laws to act like emergency declaration. And fourth were the states who opted for legislative innovation of COVID emergency laws. For example, UK opted for a Coronavirus Act to 2020, but that act was passed within 4 hours of discussion in consonance with Health and Security Act of 2008 in UK. So if you see this situation, for example, India opted for 3 different kind of legislation. Epidemic Act of 1867. Yes, 1867. It was an act that was made in the colonial time to handle bubonical plague. And another act which is not meant to handle pandemic emergency, which was there to handle natural calamities and disaster, that is Disaster Management Act 2005, linked it with Criminal Procedure Code to impose strict curfews and lockdown and impose mandate. So thereby, if you see, there is an absence of legality and predominance of extra legality, moreover, without any prior or post ratification, which is necessary in any emergency power model. Inaccurate definitions, classification, application, ratification, validation, and approval of declared or undeclared emergency power, whether exercised by statute or executive decree. One thing that has established during COVID is that COVID-19 has reestablished that theoretical narrative of emergency power is in dire need of conception, condition, application, phenomena, ontology, temporality, and implicit and explicit limitation and interpretation of emergency power in the context of pandemic emergency. And that's why it is important to see pandemic in the prism of emergency theories, because emergency theories rotate around three key questions. First is that how can we define an emergency? How can we define what is emergency? Second is how can we legally constrain emergency power? And if we are legally constraining emergency power, what kind of a control mechanism we would use? With regard to the first question, generally emergency theorists discuss about that, can state of emergency be defined? Can it be anticipated? For example, Carl Schmitt believes that it is undefinable. You cannot anticipate an emergency, but there is a new line of theorists coming, who, like David Dijkhuis and Victor Ramraj, who keep on talking about that it is possible to anticipate an emergency. For example, with reference to pandemic, it is important that we should link our law to the triggering events of pandemic, whether it is a total positivity ratio or whether it is a declaration from WHO, because these could play a very vital role in identifying whether there is a whether our law is anticipating or predicting a pandemic or reacting to the triggering events of pandemic. Second point, which is about legality, the question is, can or should law constrain officials in response of emergency threat? The same question could be used with regard to pandemic emergency powers, because the question of legality is that how can we control the abuse of authority without hampering the preemptiveness or the prompt response that is required during pandemic. I know these questions are quite conflicting questions, but if we are going to find a theory or an applicative principle for pandemic emergency, we somewhere have to discuss, deliberate, and come out of a solution for that. Third is which model we would opt for. There are three famous models in emergency theories: David Dijkhuis, Gross, and Ackerman. David Dijkhuis talks about legality, or in Gross comes in antithesis and talks about extra legality, and Ackerman's model is about legislative restraint and supermajoritorianism. I'll talk about it in a detail. For example, with regard to definition, we have to move beyond Schmittian logic of indefinability of emergency, because indefinability of an emergency provides an opportunity for arbitrariness. How can we go for definition of emergency? See, for an example, Indian Constitution under there was a provision that on internal disturbance there could be an emergency. By 44th Amendment, we defined it in a better term, and that was added as armed rebellion. Because of that provision has not been used. And there are several examples where we can react to a possible definition of pandemic emergency, reacting to the triggering points of pandemic emergency. Similarly, the principle of legality also plays a very important role, because substantive and procedural safeguards regarding rule of law are sine qua non to apply for handling any situation within pandemic emergency power. See, for example, even in extra legal model that Gross has propounded, even in that model there is a scope for legality, because once they have acted outside the legal order, there is also an option of acknowledgement of their actions. I don't know that how many pandemic emergencies providence will be acknowledged, like sovereigns are going to acknowledge their actions. And also there is an ex post ratification model, even in Gross's extra legality. And if you see Dijkhuis model, there is complete formation of how internal normativity dies in defense of necessity can play a very vital role in restricting the abuse of authority. Thus, my question is that we need to search a grounded theory of pandemic emergency if we are going to handle next pandemic in future. And for that, we have to answer a few things. First is that how we are going to define pandemic emergency, if not define, at least anticipate pandemic emergency, or make our laws ready to handle a pandemic or pandemic-like situations. Second is determine the question of legality, extra legality, legislative restraint, or a combination of these models. This could be dependent upon the state. This could be dependent upon the region. Of course, there cannot be one clear-cut formula, but we have enough resources and enough legislative and theoretical work on that, by which we can find our path towards a grounded theory of pandemic emergency. So my idea is that how within the discussion of theories of emergency, we can pave the way for a grounded theory of pandemic emergency. Thank you so much. If there is any question, I would like to respond to that. Thank you for this opportunity, Gary and Lynette.
Thank you, Punch. Next, we have Ying Wu, who is going to speak to us about a critical analysis of health security in global health governance.
She might be. Oh, yes, yes. Okay. Hi.
Yeah, hi, Professor. Thank you so much.